Mom, you have to be realistic. Either you sell the house and move to a decent home, or
I'll have to get legal intervention.
Sell the house or I'll put you in a home, my own misguided daughter Linda drawled, her voice laced with a profound, almost breathtaking entitlement. That deeply careless ultimatum spat across my kitchen table on my 80th birthday was the rotten seed of this whole glorious disaster. She, the ignorant child, thought she'd successfully trapped the frail old woman. Oh, what a catastrophic miscalculation. I just smiled, signed the paper, and went to bed. The very next morning, that materialistic little queen woke up to a financial shrapnel bomb I'd set with exquisite precision. You shallow amateurs truly thought you could seize my legacy for nothing? Ha! Not on my watch. The house was hers, yes, but so was the colossal, crushing weight of every single corrosive, unpaid debt. Now, you have to understand the sheer, blinding irony of that morning. I tell this story now from a place of quiet, victorious certainty. The game is over, and I won, not because I was crueler, but because I was a better teacher. But back then, on that specific Tuesday in early spring, the day started with a profound, deceptive peace. The sun climbed over Cedar Hill, washing the Vermont farmhouse in a light that felt both fragile and eternal. I remember the exact smell. It was the sharp, clean scent of melting snow mixed with the faint, sweet perfume of the first lilac buds outside my bedroom window. The air was still cold, the kind of cold that clings to stone and old wood. I pulled my cardigan tighter, the worn wool soft against my hands. This house, you see, was built for resilience just like me. I moved slowly, a deliberate pace learned from 80 years of life and 30 years of teaching first grade. Every sound in the house was familiar, a sort of family heartbeat. The dry, low click of the furnace starting up, the creak of the third stair when I went down to the kitchen. That morning, the quiet was thick, undisturbed by the constant noise of the world. It was the kind of silence that lets an old woman finally hear herself think. It was the last perfect morning I would have here for a long, long time. I headed straight for the kitchen. That room, always that room. It was the real center of my life, the place where love was needed and served. Above the old pine table, where decades of children had done their homework and my husband and I had shared our darkest secrets, hung a small framed piece of paper. It wasn't a wedding photo or a degree. It was Bill's messy, familiar handwriting. Love is the record of the choices we make together. I read it every day. It was my anchor, my sermon, my entire philosophy etched onto a single card. Bill had been gone 12 years now, but his words still breathed, still held the power of a sacred contract. I ran my index finger across the worn wooden frame. He wasn't talking about grand gestures or diamonds. He meant the choices. The choice to stay, the choice to forgive, the choice to bear the weight of another person's mistakes. I was 80 now. Most of my choices were behind me. What I still had, what they couldn't take, was my dignity. I stood there just watching the rising steam from my teacup. My independence wasn't a luxury. It was a non-negotiable term of surrender. The thought of being warehoused in one of those sterile, soulless care facilities made my blood run cold. They strip you of everything there. Your choice of breakfast, your memory, your very self. They see you as a burden, a cost center, a collection of assets waiting to be liquidated. I poured a second cup of Earl Grey, the fragrant steam tickling my nose. I was retired, yes, but my mind was sharper than ever. I had spent a lifetime observing human behavior, watching small, selfish children grow into large, selfish adults. Linda was my own flesh and blood, but she had stopped seeing me as a mother long ago. Now I was property. I walked over to the back window and looked out at the lilac garden. The bushes were gnarled and ancient just like me, but they were preparing. You could see the subtle promise of purple in the tight green buds. They had survived countless harsh Vermont winters. They always came back. This house had witnessed everything. My wedding, the birth of my children. Bill's quiet, agonizing decline. It wasn't just wood and plaster, it was a vessel of history. It held the invisible record of my choices. I thought about my small inheritance, the paltry sum that Linda always assumed was mine to squander. She had this terrible, modern arrogance, this assumption that my life's work, my legacy, was simply money waiting for her husband's next catastrophic business failure. I knew the difference between love and debt. I knew the difference between true care and manipulative control disguised as concern. Linda always confused the two. She confused her obligation to her mother with her entitlement to her mother's things. I opened the kitchen cupboard and reached for the silver bell, the one we used to ring to call the children in from the fields. It was polished now, but its ring was still high and clear. I held it in my hand, feeling the cold, smooth weight of the metal. It felt like a decision waiting to be made. The morning news murmured softly on the radio, a distant sound of chaos that didn't yet touch Cedar Hill. The sun was fully up. It was 10 minutes past 9. I sat back down at the table, taking a slow sip of my tea. My heart felt heavy but strangely clear. I was 80 years old, widowed, and facing an imminent betrayal. But I was still Ellen Harper, and Ellen Harper still had a lesson left to teach. I felt a slight tingling in the air, a shift in the house's energy. The front door chime sounded, not the friendly ring of a neighbor, but the sharp, expectant buzz of an impending crisis. The peace shattered instantly, like brittle glass. Linda was here. The reckoning had begun. I didn't know then exactly what I would do, but I knew two things with perfect, chilling clarity. I would not be defeated, and my daughter was about to receive the most difficult and most crucial lesson of her entire life. The sharp, expectant buzz of the door chime. That was Linda's signature, wasn't it? Never a soft knock, always a command. It broke the silence of the house like brittle glass, just as I'd known it would. I took a deep, steadying breath. When you're 80, you learn that every confrontation starts not with a shout, but with controlling the air in your own lungs. I heard the front door open, followed by the clatter of a small, store-bought cake box hitting the wooden entryway table. Even her gestures of affection were hurried, almost violent. I stayed put, waiting for her to come to me. I had poured her tea, English breakfast, her favorite, but it was already cooling. A perfect metaphor for our relationship, I thought, with a grim little smile. Then she was there, framed in the kitchen doorway. Linda, my daughter, 52 years old but carrying the frantic, nervous energy of a teenager who just lost her allowance. Her face was impeccably made up, her blonde hair precisely styled, but her eyes, those beautiful blue eyes, were too bright, too fixed. They were the eyes of a person hiding a desperate secret behind a facade of polished competence. "Happy birthday, Mom," she announced, her voice pitched artificially high, too sweet. She leaned in to give me a fleeting air kiss, the kind that avoids all genuine contact. I looked at her calmly. "Thank you, dear. The lilacs are just starting to show color. Did you notice?" She barely glanced toward the window. "Oh yes, lovely. Listen, Mom, can we just—" She pulled out the chair across from me, scraping it loudly against the tile floor. "Can we talk about something serious?" I simply pushed the cooling teacup toward her. "Drink your tea, Linda. We have plenty of time. Sit, please." That slight pause, that gentle but firm insertion of a boundary, always annoyed her. I watched her exhale sharply and sit down, her spine stiff. A teacher's trick, demanding silence before presenting the lesson. She picked up the cup, but her hand was trembling slightly. That little vibration in her fingers, told me everything. Her husband's business, the one I'd warned her about years ago, was finally underwater. This wasn't a birthday visit. This was a reconnaissance mission. She took a quick, scalding sip of the tea, forcing herself to focus. "Look, I know you love this place," she started, the tone dripping with false empathy. "And Bill did a wonderful job, but this house is too much for you now." She emphasized too much as if describing an excessive dessert. I let the silence hang warm and heavy, listening to the tiny tick-tick of the old grandfather clock in the hall. She rushed on, filling the void with anxiety. "I spoke to the specialists, And the property taxes, Mom, they're insane. The roof needs replacing, the furnace is ancient. I worry about you up here all alone. She worry about me? I almost laughed out loud. I thought about the night a few months ago when the power went out during a brutal blizzard. I hadn't called her. I simply stoked the wood stove, lit a kerosene lamp, and read a book until dawn. I was not helpless. I was 80, not dead. My solitude is not a disease, Linda. I told her softly, my voice calm but carrying the weight of command. And the house is sound. Bill saw to that. She waved her hand dismissively, brushing away the memory of her father and 40 years of careful maintenance. But you need care, Mom. Real professional care. If you sold this place, it's worth a fortune now, Cedar Hill property. You could afford the nicest assisted living facility. Full-time nursing, prepared meals, company. I felt the ice forming in my gut. That word. Care. In her mouth, it wasn't an act of love. It was a vicious weapon of convenience. She was using the threat of my frail aging as a means to financial gain. She was reducing my dignity to an equation of profit and loss. I looked at the frame note again. Choices. Linda was trying to rob me of my final, most important choice, where and how I would end my story. So what you're proposing? I said, my tone flat, purely analytical, the former school teacher dissecting a poor argument, is that I liquidate my home, my memory, and my independence so I can live under corporate supervision. And what precisely is the benefit to you in this arrangement? That hit her. Her eyes flickered, the mask of concern slipping just long enough for me to see the raw, desperate fear beneath. She leaned in, lowering her voice, trying to make it sound like a secret, a shared conspiracy. It's for all of us, Mom. We need stability. I just need a little cushion right now, just until Dave's new venture takes off. If you sign over the house, we can handle the sale efficiently. It saves you the headache. The sheer contemptible entitlement of it made my head spin. She wanted a cushion, and my entire life was the stuffing. Then came the full, venomous release of the ultimatum, the words that would replay in my mind for months, not in anger, but in cold, strategic calculation. She set the teacup down with a light clink that sounded deafening in the silence. Her face hardened, all pretense gone. Mom, you have to be realistic. Either you sell the house and move to a decent home, or... She paused, her lip curling slightly. Or I'll have to get legal intervention. For your own good, of course. We'll argue that you're no longer capable of managing your own affairs. There it was. Guardianship, the ultimate humiliating threat. The suggestion that I was a child who needed a court-appointed custodian. I didn't flinch. I just smiled, the slow, unsettling smile of a woman who knows a deep, cosmic joke that her adversary has yet to grasp. My smile wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. It was a promise. I see, I replied, the words barely a whisper. Then I understand the choice you've put before me, Linda. She mistook my composure for resignation. A flash of predatory relief crossed her face. The vulture had scented the kill. She took a folder from her oversized handbag, a legal-looking folder. I felt the dry, scratchy paper on my skin just from looking at it. She was prepared. She had done her homework, but only the kind that benefited her rapacious agenda. I have the preliminary paperwork right here, she said, her voice now smooth, victorious. Just a few signatures, Mom, and this whole painful process can be over. We can all move on. I didn't touch the folder. I just looked past her, toward the kitchen bell hanging by the door. The sun caught the silver, making it flash. Move on. She thought it was that easy to erase a lifetime of memory, responsibility, and love. I let her ramble on about assisted living amenities and market valuations, but I wasn't listening. My mind was already elsewhere. I was in a sterile, cold bank office talking quietly to Charlie, my dear friend and former bank officer. I was signing papers not of defeat, but of strategic, devastating compliance. I had been given an ultimatum: surrender my dignity or lose my choice. I decided right then to do neither. I would satisfy her request for the house, yes, but I would teach her the catastrophic consequence of true ownership. My choice would be the final, most crucial word. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table, still warm from the teacup. I looked Linda straight in her eager, panicked eyes. "Very well, Linda," I said, my voice ringing with a newfound terrifying clarity. "We can certainly move on. Just let me review that folder tonight, and we'll deal with all the signatures tomorrow." She beamed, a genuine, relieved smile this time. A truly disgusting sight. She thought she'd won. She gathered her materials, kissed me quickly on the cheek, and rushed out, leaving the weight of her desperation hanging in the air. I sat there for a long time after she left, the silence of the house returning, but now it was a silence full of intent. The lilacs, preparing for their purple bloom, looked like they were holding their breath. I was done being the patient, passive victim. I was done being simply Mom. The next morning, I would call Charlie. The lesson was about to begin, and oh, dear readers, it was going to be an absolute bloodbath of financial reckoning. I could almost hear the ringing of that kitchen bell, not as a call to dinner, but as a warning. But first, I had to sleep on my decision, let the cold reality settle into my bones. That decision was going to be the most satisfying, glorious choice I'd made in decades, and it would change everything. The question wasn't if I would sign, but exactly what I would sign, and to whom the burden would truly fall. The front door slammed shut, hard, rattling the glass in the antique hall mirror. That final crass noise from Linda was the end of the argument, but the beginning of the real war. It didn't sound like my daughter leaving. It sounded like a thief taking inventory of my soul. I stood motionless in the kitchen, holding the heavy silence like a piece of shattered pottery. The air was still thick with the metallic, ugly scent of her desperation, and my own cold fury. You ladies know this feeling, don't you? That moment when the person you raised, the one you sacrificed your very youth for, looks at you and sees only a liquidation value. It's a pain that doesn't stab. It erodes you, grain by grain. I felt 80 years of dignity trying to hold back a tidal wave of sheer, seething resentment. I didn't cry. Crying is for the defeated, and I have never been defeated in my life. Not by poverty, not by grief, and certainly not by a spoiled, entitled adult child hunting for a windfall. I walked slowly back through the house, turning off lights she had left blazing. Wasteful, always so wasteful. I needed the darkness. I needed the quiet to think, not as a mother, but as a strategist. I finally reached my bedroom, the window overlooking the ancient lilac bushes. The buds were barely visible in the fading twilight. I sank onto the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned beneath my weight, a familiar, comforting sound. I peeled off my sensible daytime clothes and put on my oldest flannel nightgown, the one Bill loved. It felt rough and honest against my skin. I slid beneath the cold, crisp sheets. The chill was immediately invigorating. I lay there, perfectly still, letting the full gravity of her ultimatum settle over me. Sell the house or I'll put you in a home. Not, please, Mom, we need help. Not, I'm scared, Mom. Just a brutal, bald assertion of control. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the erasure. They wanted to erase my history, my choice, my very existence, and replace it with a clipboard and a scheduled mealtime. I thought of my friend, Betty, who went into a home last year. Her children visit on Sundays. She calls me sometimes just to hear a familiar voice. She sounds like a ghost. Number, that would not be my fate. I reached up and felt around on the bedside table for the old leather-bound journal. Bill gave it to me on our 25th anniversary. I opened it haphazardly, the pages smelling faintly of vanilla and old paper. Inside the front cover, tucked carefully under the silk lining, was a pressed lilac bloom and a second copy of his framed note. I held the card in my shaking hand. His handwriting, a little shaky even then, looked defiant. Love is the record of the choices we make together. I stared at those words until they stopped being advice and started being a command. For 12 years, they had been a comfort. Now they were a weapon. What choice was I being asked to make? The easy one. Meekly surrender my home, my dignity, and fade into the bureaucracy of assisted living. That would be the easy choice for them. But Bill taught me that love wasn't just about giving comfort, it was about accepting responsibility. Linda wanted ownership, the house, the land, the equity. But she refused the responsibility that came with it. That was the disconnect. That was the lesson. I realized then that this couldn't be revenge. Revenge is a shallow, miserable thing. It leaves a bitter taste in your mouth and nothing else. No, this had to be teaching. This had to be the final, most comprehensive lesson in ownership and accountability I would ever give my daughter. I remember thinking with a burst of ferocious clarity, I taught her how to read. I taught her how to drive a stick shift, and by God, I'm going to teach her the true cost of covetousness. This house was not merely an asset to be sold. It was 40 years of hard work, deferred maintenance, property taxes, and a mortgage Bill took out to help her when her first husband walked out. It was a weight. Linda saw only the prize. I had to ensure she felt the full, crushing weight of the pedestal it sat on. The plan formed in my mind with frightening speed and precision. It wasn't a complex scheme, it was a simple legal truth, twisted just slightly enough to be a moral trap. She wanted the house? Fine, she could have it, but she must take the whole thing, the good, the bad, and the ugly truth of its financial burden. I smiled in the darkness, a wide, slow, entirely satisfying smile. That smile wasn't motivated by malice, it was motivated by the sheer pride of a teacher who has found the perfect instructional tool. You think you're so smart, Linda? You think you've outmaneuvered your old mother? Fools. You couldn't even see the most obvious loophole. The feeling of my own power returning, my agency, was intoxicating. It wasn't the strength of youth, but the dense, heavy strength of old oak. Pathetic little power play. I would turn her greed into a crucible, and she would either learn responsibility or burn. I was simply forcing her to record her own choice. I thought about Margaret, my church friend. Margaret would preach forgiveness. She would tell me to let go, to pray for Linda, to turn the other cheek. No, Margaret, I whispered into the quiet room. Sometimes love demands a surgical consequence. You can't forgive what hasn't been acknowledged. I had the knowledge, the motive, and the cold, unflinching will. All I needed now was the mechanical facilitator. I reached for the worn cotton robe hanging on the back of the door. My 80-year-old knees protested as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the cold wood floor shocking my bare feet. I ignored the discomfort, the old stone bank building downtown, the man who had been the bank manager there for 30 years, the one who helped Bill navigate our financial life. Charlie, my friend. He understood the difference between legality and morality. He knew every dark corner of local property law. He owed Bill a favor, maybe two, and he valued quiet dignity above all else. I felt a sudden electric surge of energy. The game was on. The darkness felt less like isolation and more like my own personal covert operations center. I knew exactly where the old metal filing box was, the one holding the original deed and the documentation for the property's outstanding lien. It was time to gather the evidence. It was time to execute the final lesson. I walked to the closet and pulled out my heavy woolen coat. I wasn't going to wait for morning. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. The key to the file box was hidden in the heel of an old boot in the back corner. I had to find the deed. I had to find Charlie, and I had to do it before Linda had a chance to lawyer up and make her first rapacious move. I locked the bedroom door behind me. The house was now silent again, waiting. I had a task, a mission, a moral mandate. Tomorrow, I told the darkness, the paper will be signed. The house will be hers, and the debt will be the most exquisite gift she has ever received. The only sound was the rustle of the deed as I pulled the box out into the pale hallway light. My entire life I had corrected papers. Now I was about to correct a life, but first I needed to know, could I truly trust Charlie with this explosive secret? And how exactly do you tell an old friend that you are about to use the full force of the legal system to teach your own child a brutal, unforgettable lesson? The cold hit me immediately when I stepped outside. It wasn't the fresh, honest cold of day, but the deep, bone-chilling dampness of a Vermont night just before dawn. The air smelled thick like wet earth and the ghost of winter. My breath plumed out in little clouds, exquisite little clouds, I thought, like smoke signals for the war I was about to start. I had the heavy metal box tucked under one arm. It contained the deed, the bank documents, and the damning proof of the property's outstanding encumbrances. The sheer weight of it felt good, substantial. It felt like history and leverage all rolled into one. My old station wagon, the one Linda always mocked for being antediluvian, started on the first try. Always reliable, always trustworthy, something my daughter could never say for herself. The drive downtown took only 20 minutes, but in that darkness, every mile felt like an escape. The winding road was slick, reflecting the pale, hesitant moonlight. I focused on the beams of the headlights cutting through the gloom. No looking back. Never look back when you're driving, and never look back when you've made a hard, necessary choice. The bank, the old granite fortress where Charlie worked, sat at the end of Main Street. It was closed, of course. Everything was closed. But I knew Charlie. Charlie, like Bill, was a creature of habit and responsibility. He was always there before sunrise, drinking bitter coffee and preparing for the day's relentless absurdity. I parked across the street and waited. The cold started to creep past my woolen coat. The leather of the steering wheel felt like ice beneath my gloved fingers. I turned on the radio, soft, classical music, a little Vivaldi, to steady my nerves. At 5:45, just as the sky was beginning to bleed a faint, icy blue, Charlie's old beat-up pickup truck pulled into the back lot. Punctuality. God, I love that man's predictability. I watched him walk to the staff entrance. He was a little stooped now, his hair thinner, but the same solid, square-shouldered figure Bill used to share a bourbon with every Thursday. I got out of the car. My 80-year-old knees didn't just protest this time, they filed a formal complaint. But the adrenaline was a fierce, hot engine inside my chest. I grabbed the box and walked across the street, the sound of my sensible shoes echoing loudly on the empty pavement. He was just putting the key in the side door when I cleared my throat. "Charlie, you're early," I said, my voice sounding rough and unused in the cold air. He jumped, dropping his thermos. It didn't break, thankfully. He looked at me, his face a sudden mask of shock and concern. "Ellen? For God's sake, what are you doing here? It's barely 6 o'clock. His voice was low, gravelly, with sleep and worry. He rushed over to me, his hands instantly reaching to steady my arm. That small, genuine gesture spoke volumes about his character. "I need to talk," I told him, keeping my tone perfectly even. "And this can't wait until business hours." I held up the metal box. "It's about the house." He understood immediately. Charlie knew about Linda's escalating financial turpitude. He knew about the loan Bill took out years ago to bail her out of that failed restaurant venture. He had processed the paperwork. He unlocked the door and ushered me into his office, the air inside smelling of stale coffee and money. He didn't ask questions. He just turned on a small lamp, the light casting long, dramatic shadows. He sat down behind his heavy oak desk, a desk that looked older than both of us, and gestured for me to take the worn leather chair opposite him. "All right, Ellen," he said, his eyes kind but serious. "Tell me what atrocity she's threatened now." I didn't mince words. I told him about the ultimatum, the home, the immediate demand for the sale. I spoke in flat, clinical tones, reciting the facts, not the feelings. It was the only way to get through it without my voice breaking. When I finished, Charlie ran a hand over his face. That's reprehensible, Ellen. We can get you a lawyer. We can fight this." I opened the metal box and slid the folded deed and the lien documents across the desk. They rustled softly on the polished wood. "No, Charlie." "You misunderstand," I said, leaning forward. "I'm not fighting the ultimatum. I'm accepting it." His brow furrowed. "What?" "I'm signing the house over to her. Today, but I need your help to ensure she gets the house exactly as it is. Not just the 4 walls and the lilac garden, the whole package. I paused, making sure he was looking directly into my eyes. This was the moment of truth. My trust in him and his moral compass was on the line. "Charlie," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "I need to confirm that when I sign the deed, the outstanding second lien bill secured, the one she doesn't know about, the one we structured as a home equity loan but never discharged, is fully, legally, and immediately transferred to her as the new owner." The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whir of the computers powering up in the vault room. Charlie picked up the lien document, his hands shaking slightly. He was a professional, a man of law and order. What I was asking for was entirely legal, but morally treacherous. "You want to teach her a lesson," he said, the words heavy with judgment and understanding. "No," I corrected him, my voice firm. "I want to teach her the cost of ownership. Linda sees the house as a lottery ticket. I see it as a $50,000 debt Bill took on to save her from financial ruin 10 years ago. She refuses to acknowledge the debt of gratitude. I'm simply making her acknowledge the debt of principle." He looked at the papers, then at me. "Ellen, this will cripple her. She and James, they'll lose everything." "Then maybe," I told him, my voice steel, "they will finally learn the value of something they can't sell." I taught her how to save her pennies. Now I'm teaching her the weight of a mortgage. She wanted control. This is the ultimate control, Charlie. It's the record of her choice. Bill's record. My final choice. He sighed, a deep, tired sound. He reached into his drawer, pulled out his reading glasses, and put them on. He picked up his pen, a heavy, familiar instrument of his trade. He read the documents carefully, his lips moving silently. After a long minute that stretched into an eternity, he looked up. His eyes were sad, but the worry was gone, replaced by a deep, shared sense of history. "You're right," he said softly, putting the pen down. "It's all perfectly legal. The lien follows the property, but Ellen, if this is a vengeful act, are you sure you can live with the consequences?" "I'm 80 years old, Charlie. I can live with the consequences of my own making," I stated, the finality ringing in my voice. "The alternative is living with the consequence of hers. Now can you prepare the transfer deed, ensuring all prior liabilities are assigned to the new owner, Ms. Linda May Harper?" He nodded slowly. "I can. I will. For Bill." The small, intimate office suddenly felt larger, full of possibility. The game was truly on. Charlie was my key. I left Charlie with the documents, the cold air now feeling almost refreshing. The transfer was set for the following evening at Linda's birthday dinner celebration. She thought she was going to be celebrating my surrender. Little did she know, I was preparing the script for her total, humiliating downfall. But there was one last thing I needed to do before the signing, a small but crucial physical assurance that her new inheritance was more trouble than she could ever manage, an unwelcome gift lurking right beneath the surface. I told Charlie I needed one more thing, a small, crucial detail, something that would solidify the lesson, make it tangible, real. You can teach a child the theory of gravity, but they won't truly know it until they fall down and scrape a knee. This was my knee-scraping moment for Linda. The house was empty again. The bank had been a cold shock, but returning home, I felt the familiar warmth of my plan unfolding. The atmosphere was heavy, expectant, like the air right before a summer storm. Before the signing, before the grand ceremonial dinner Linda was hosting, her own victory lap, I had a specific task. I headed straight for the old tool shed out back. It smelled of rust, dry earth, and Bill's phantom pipe smoke. It was a beautiful, honest smell. My unwelcome gift. It wasn't money. It wasn't a legal trick. It was a tiny, physical assurance of the property's neglect. I rummaged through the clutter until my fingers closed around the handle of the old monkey wrench. It felt cold, heavy, and immensely satisfying. I also found the flashlight with the weak yellow beam and a roll of gray duct tape that was older than Linda's marriage. Everything I needed. My target was the main water valve. It's located in the cellar, tucked behind the washing machine, the most inaccessible, unloved spot in the entire house. The cellar stairs were steep and wooden, groaning with every careful step I took. The air down there was always cooler, carrying the faint, earthy scent of potatoes and concrete. I aimed the weak flashlight beam. Dust motes danced in the light, thick and dizzying. I finally reached the cold, damp back wall. There it was, the main shut-off valve, a rusty old thing that hadn't been touched in maybe 15 years. Bill always took care of it, always checked it, always kept it lubricated. Since he passed, I hadn't had the strength or the need. Now I had the need. I knelt down, ignoring the sharp protest from my knees. I looked at the wrench, then at the valve. This wasn't about destroying the house. It was about ensuring that the instant Linda needed the house to function for her profit, it would violently, spectacularly fail. I worked slowly, carefully, not tightening, but loosening. Just enough to introduce a catastrophic vulnerability. The metal groaned in protest, a sound like an old man waking from a deep sleep. I turned the nut on the main line connection, just a quarter turn, then another, ever so slight. The threads were old, brittle, perfect. I stood up, rubbing the gritty rust off my hands. It was done. A small, silent time bomb nestled in the deepest part of her new inheritance. She could sell the roof, the walls, the garden, but she would have to deal with the inevitable, explosive plumbing failure lurking beneath the floorboards. I climbed the stairs, the scent of earth clinging to my nightclothes. My heart was pounding, not from exertion, but from the wicked, delicious joy of a plan executed flawlessly. That evening, the dining room was too bright, too loud. Linda and her husband James had arrived early, dressed in what they considered their power clothes. Linda wore a sharp crimson suit that made her look like a predatory bird. James, all cheap cologne and forced charm, looked like a nervous attendant. The table was set with the china I hadn't used since Bill's funeral. The hypocrisy was almost physically painful. This wasn't a celebration of my 80th birthday. It was a signing ceremony for my forced abdication. "You look wonderful, Mother," Linda declared, her voice sickeningly sweet, placing a ridiculously large, ornate cake on the sideboard. "We made sure to get the papers drawn up exactly how you wanted. Clean, simple." I just smiled, a thin, perfectly neutral expression that gave nothing away. "I appreciate your efficiency, darling." I let the darling hang in the air like a faint, poisonous vapor. The dinner was a blur of their self-congratulatory chatter. They talked about flipping the property, about the high-end buyers they already had lined up, about turning the old tool shed into a boutique workshop. Every word was a tiny, sharp needle to my heart. Linda finally pushed the documents toward me across the gleaming mahogany table. The deed looked like any other piece of paper, innocuous, harmless. "Just here, Mother," James purred, holding out a gold-plated pen. "The notary is waiting on the phone line to witness." Just one simple signature. I picked up the pen. It felt foreign and frivolous in my hand. This wasn't Bill's sturdy fountain pen. It was an instrument of immediate gratification. I looked at Linda. Her face was flushed with anticipation, her eyes glittering with unrestrained greed. She saw her future in that signature. A new car, a new business. She saw escape. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the pen to the paper and wrote my name. Ellen May Harper. The letters were steady, firm, and absolutely final. I didn't just sign a deed, I sealed a contract for her education. I pushed the papers back, the rustle of the parchment loud in the suddenly silent room. "There you are," I said, my voice low and smooth. "It's all yours now, Linda." "Every bit of it. I'm so pleased." Linda snatched the deed up, holding it like a championship trophy. "Thank you, Mother. Truly, this means everything." "It should," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "It is the record of your choice, after all." James beamed, pouring champagne. The sound of the fizzing bubbles was like a tiny celebratory drum roll for their impending doom. They didn't even notice me get up. I walked to the kitchen and stood by the back door, listening to the wind pick up outside. The wind was getting stronger, whipping around the chimney. Suddenly I heard it, the small, sharp, solitary ring of the old silver bell hanging by the door. Ding! Just once. It wasn't me, and it wasn't them. The wind had caught the rope, perhaps, or maybe it was Bill, signaling his quiet approval. The house itself had rung in the new owner and the devastating, unavoidable lesson that came with her inheritance. I smiled, a genuine private smile. The signing was complete. The house was no longer my responsibility. It was hers. I spent the night in a local motel, the thin walls and unfamiliar mattress a strange kind of freedom. But the next morning, as I sat drinking weak coffee and reading a borrowed newspaper, my phone rang. The call wasn't from Linda. It was Charlie. His voice was grim, but there was a hint of something else, a strange satisfaction. "Ellen," he said. "She tried to pull equity out this morning." Linda finally found the nasty surprise waiting for her at the bank. But there's a problem. She's threatened to call the state regulator claiming fraud, and I think she just went back to the house to find you. You ladies know that feeling of deep, exhausted sleep after a truly monumental decision? That's how I woke up in the motel room. The sheets smelled of cheap detergent, and the weak coffee tasted like burnt plastic. But I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd finally settled an overdue account. Then the phone rang. It was Charlie. His voice was all business, but underneath the professionalism, I could hear the faint, vicious pleasure of a man who'd just seen justice delivered. "Ellen," he said, wasting no time. "She was here at 9, bright and early. Tried to pull $40,000 out of the home equity line to pay off her credit cards." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. And she was informed quite formally that the property transfer was recorded this morning. Furthermore, as the new owner, she has assumed all encumbrances, including the second lien Bill took out 10 years ago. Ah, the truth finally delivered via a bank teller's dispassionate script. It was far more effective than any argument I could have initiated myself. Brilliant. What was her reaction? I asked, keeping my tone mild. "Let's just say," Charlie responded dryly, "that the state regulator was mentioned, and then the word fraud was used liberally. I explained to her that the deed she signed explicitly transfers the property with its existing financial liabilities. Everything was legal, Ellen. Exacting, in fact. But she's frantic, and I think she just went back to the house to find you." I thanked him and hung up. The clock on the bedside table read 9:30 a.m., perfect timing. I folded the borrowed newspaper neatly, finished my coffee, and packed my overnight bag. I wasn't running away. I was meeting my student for her first lesson. I drove back slowly, deliberately, pulling the old station wagon into the driveway. Linda's crimson SUV was parked haphazardly, half on the lawn, a clear sign of unhinged panic. The front door was ajar. I pushed it open. "Linda," I called out calmly. The house was silent, but it wasn't the peaceful silence of the day before. This was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with rage. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the antique mahogany table where she had signed her fate just hours earlier. She wasn't wearing her power suit anymore. She was in a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, her face pale, her hair mussed, and her eyes wide with a look of pure, unadulterated betrayal. "Where is it?" she hissed, her voice shaking violently. "Where is what, darling?" I asked, walking past her to put my bag down near the coat rack. I moved slowly, making every motion measured and deliberate. "The money! The clean deed. That loan. You knew about that loan, didn't you? You didn't pay it off. You just dumped it on me." She threw a crumple of papers, the bank's official transfer documents, onto the table. I walked to the stove, put the kettle on, and placed a tea bag in my favorite ceramic mug. I ignored the papers and the hysteria. "That loan, Linda," I said, my back to her, my voice gentle and informative, "is the one your father took out 10 years ago to keep your failed gourmet pet food business afloat. Remember that? The one you promised to repay but conveniently forgot about? It's not a surprise, dear. It's the cost of rescue." She stared at me, her mouth hanging open, the smell of her cheap perfume mixed with the rising steam from the kettle. You set me up," she whispered, the color draining from her face. "This is fraud." I'm calling the regulator. I'll call the police. I turned, finally holding my steaming cup of Earl Grey. The warmth of the mug was a pleasant anchor. Call whoever you like, Linda. Charlie is waiting for the call. He has every piece of documentation. The transfer is legal. It's been recorded. You wanted the house? You have it. You demanded my retirement? You have purchased it. The debt, however, is yours. Every single penny, I walked over to the dining table and sat down, crossing my legs elegantly. You called this a simple transaction, remember? Clean, simple. But you only saw the profit, Linda. You didn't see the 40 years of maintenance. You didn't see the burden of keeping the lights on and the pipes from freezing. You only saw the liquidation value of your mother's life. She began to pace, her steps agitated and sharp on the hardwood floor. Vicious energy radiated from her, like heat from a furnace. I won't pay it. I'll just sell the house. I'll sell it to the flippers this afternoon. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. It was scalding hot, but my control was absolute. Go ahead. But first, you might want to call a plumber. She stopped pacing. A what? A plumber, dear. When you tell your prospective buyers about the recent explosive plumbing failure in the cellar, they might ask to see the inspection report. You remember the old main valve behind the washing machine? It tends to be temperamental when it's been neglected for over a decade. I watched the realization dawn on her face. The look of shock was replaced by raw, ugly terror. She understood. Her prize was damaged goods. You went down there? You vandalized your own home? Vandalism? I smiled, that triumphant paternalistic smile I reserve for the truly obtuse. No, Linda. I merely allowed a long-ignored flaw to reach its natural conclusion. I allowed the house to show its true colors. You're the owner now. That repair and the resulting damage to the foundation is now your responsibility. The silence that fell then was the deepest I have ever known. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the total absence of argument. For the first time, the heavy, crushing weight of reality shifted from my shoulders to hers. The predator became the prey. The student had received her syllabus. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the screaming child, but a woman paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her own greed. I tried to tell you, Linda, I said softly, my voice carrying the full weight of a fulfilled prophecy. Love is the record of the choices we make. You chose the house over your mother. Now you must live with the house's exacting record. I picked up my bag. The lesson was delivered. My work here was done. I left her standing there, alone with the documents, the ruined house, and the dizzying weight of an unexpected debt. I didn't know then where I was going, maybe Margaret's, maybe the coast, but I knew I was free. I drove away, glancing in the rearview mirror only once. Linda hadn't moved. She was just a figure in a window, shrinking away from her new life. But even as I felt the elation of my victory, a tiny, corrosive doubt began to creep in. Was this truly over? Could a lesson this harsh ever lead to reconciliation? Or had I simply severed the last, brittle thread between us forever? They say that revenge is best served cold, but what nobody tells you is that freedom feels a little bit like that too. Cold, empty. The elation of that morning, the look on Linda's face, the finality of the slamming car door. It lasted maybe 24 hours. Then came the vast, silent vacuum. I spent those first 3 months drifting. I stayed with Margaret in the city for a week, surrounded by the clamor and the quick, sharp rhythm of urban life. Margaret, bless her soul, was a terrible cook but a wonderful listener. She would just let me talk, or mostly, just let me sit in silence. Ellen, she said one afternoon, her voice soft, revenge is poison. Did it taste good going down? I remember my answer, my grand philosophy now tasting like ashes. It tasted like medicine, Margaret. But sometimes medicine leaves a bitter aftertaste, that corrosive doubt I felt driving away. It settled in like a persistent low-grade fever. I had won the battle for my dignity, but I feared I had lost the war for my daughter. I hadn't heard a word from Linda or James, not a screaming phone call, not a threat, nothing. It was the silence of total severance. I moved on, staying in quiet, anonymous towns along the coast. I found myself reading Bill's old journals late at night. The pages smelled of cedar and dust. I was searching for proof that my choice, my harsh, calculated lesson, was the right one. In one entry dated 10 years prior, right after he bailed Linda out, he wrote, "Love is not possession. It's the courage to teach." I read that line every night. Courage to teach. That's what I kept coming back to. But how do you know the student has learned the lesson if they refuse to show their work? I went back to Vermont in the late autumn. The light was fragile, golden and fleeting. I rented a tiny cottage near the church. It wasn't Cedar Hill, but the air still carried that familiar scent of pine and impending frost. It felt like a safe harbor. I still drove past the house sometimes, slowly, too slowly. It was a compulsion, a strange, morbid curiosity. Linda's crimson SUV was still parked haphazardly on the lawn, but the house itself looked different. Humbled, there was a new, raw patch of earth near the back foundation. The plumber had been called. The lesson, the literal cost of neglect, had been absorbed. Then, one cold, windy Tuesday afternoon, a few days before Thanksgiving, she appeared. I was at the small, granite-worn grave of Bill, laying down a wreath of dried hydrangeas. The cemetery was silent except for the rattling of dry leaves across the stones. The air was sharp, biting, smelling of decay and wet leaves. A car pulled up behind me. I knew the sound of that engine. My heart leaped, a sudden, ferocious thump in my chest. I stood up straight, brushing the dirt from my sensible coat. I didn't turn around. I made her come to me. She walked slowly across the grass. I watched her reflection in the glass of the large framed portrait on Bill's headstone. She looked thinner. Her clothes were muted, a simple gray sweater and dark jeans. No power suit, no excessive makeup. The change was startling. She stopped maybe 5 feet behind me. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. It wasn't the angry silence of the kitchen, but a fragile, penitent one. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, rough with something I hadn't heard from her in decades. Vulnerability. "Mother." I turned slowly and looked her in the eye. I didn't speak. I just waited. The burden of this conversation was entirely hers to bear. The plumber was $4,700, she said, her tone flat, and the foundation damage was almost double that. We had to sell James's boat. She laughed, a short, bitter, hollow sound. "I'm sorry, Linda," I said genuinely. "That's a terrible cost." "No," she insisted, shaking her head. "No, it's not. It's the real cost. I went to the town hall. I looked up all the records, the tax liens you paid, the insurance premiums you covered even when you were sick, the way Dad scrambled to get that equity loan so your little boutique pet food disaster wouldn't put you in the poorhouse." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She just stared at Bill's name etched in the granite. "I thought the house was money, Mother," she confessed, the word mother sounding small and honest. "I saw a number." I didn't see the record. I didn't see the memory. She stepped forward, closer than she had been since the reading of the will. Her hand reached out, hesitant, trembling slightly. "I didn't just lose the profit," she said, her voice catching. "I lost the only place I ever felt safe. And I realized, and you didn't take it from me. I threw it away. I threw you away." She didn't ask for forgiveness. That was the most important detail. She offered only understanding. I reached out and took her hand. It was cold, calloused from work, or maybe just from fear. It trembled then, under my grasp, it steadied. Forgiveness didn't arrive with grand pronouncements or tearful apologies. It came with the quiet, shared weight of that physical touch. The thread was no longer brittle, it was healing. "Go home, Linda," I told her softly, my thumb stroking the back of her hand. "Go home and be the owner of the house. Don't be the flipper, be the owner." She nodded, pulled her hand away, and wiped her eyes quickly. She looked back at Bill's grave, then at me. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mother." "And to you, darling," I replied. I watched her walk back to the car. She paused at the door, but this time she didn't look back at me. She looked back at Bill's stone, a small, solitary figure acknowledging her history. The winter was long and quiet. I never went back to the house, but Charlie would call with updates. Linda had paid off the outstanding lien. Linda was seen hauling lumber for the porch. Linda was planting flowers. She was paying the price and making the house her own. The true measure of the lesson was not the debt, but the planting. Spring arrived again, the air soft and green, smelling of thawing earth. I decided it was time to leave the town behind, but before I did, I had to see the result of my grand project one last time. I had to know if the lilacs, Bill's lilacs, had returned. The smell of my own old cotton sheets, that was the first true gift of the morning. I woke up in my own bed at Cedar Hill, and the air held the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke and Bill's worn flannel. Linda was gone, but the house felt different, lighter, cleaner. I found the note she left on the kitchen counter next to my ceramic mug. It wasn't an apology, ladies. Linda isn't the kind for grand pronouncements. It was just a request, simple and practical. The house needs a new coat of paint on the porch. Can you help me pick the color? A request for collaboration, not control. A shared decision about maintenance, not a demand for liquidation. I smiled, a tired, genuine smile. I was reaching for the phone to call her back, to agree to the most mundane, ordinary task, a task of partnership, when Charlie's voice sliced through the peace. "Ellen, I just saw the news," he said, his voice sharp with urgency, completely blowing away my gentle mood. "It's that investment firm. Meridian Group, the one Linda was trying to sell the house to on the sly before you signed the deed." I sat down hard on the old pine bench by the counter, the blood draining from my face. My hand gripped the receiver until my knuckles were white. "What about them, Charlie?" "They were indicted this morning." Massive, brazen fraud, securities violations, money laundering, the works. They were essentially a sophisticated shell corporation. Their entire business model was buying up distressed properties, stripping the equity, and vanishing. The world spun for a moment. I closed my eyes, picturing Linda, crimson suit, glittering with greed, urging me to sign. If I had listened to her, if I had simply signed the deed without the debt trap, she would have sold Cedar Hill to them a month ago. "Charlie," I whispered, the word thick in my throat. "If Linda had signed the final sales papers with them?" He finished the thought for me, his voice serious. "She wouldn't be paying a mortgage, Ellen. She'd be facing an impossible legal battle. She would have lost the house anyway, likely without a dime, caught up in the federal investigation as a hostile witness. Your act of revenge, Ellen, wasn't just a lesson. It was a miraculous rescue I didn't speak for a long moment. My revenge, my carefully planned vicious little piece of theater, had saved her from financial ruin. I hadn't just taught her a lesson. I had inadvertently built a firewall against her own short-sighted greed. It was the most profound, deeply ironic twist of fate. It seemed, I finally managed, leaning back and looking up at the ceiling, that my choices, even the darkest ones, still had the effect of protection. Maybe Bill was right. After all, I hung up, feeling a strange mix of vindication and profound humility. I had aimed for justice, and the universe had delivered mercy, disguised as a bureaucratic nightmare. The cosmic joke was on both of us. Months passed. Winter turned to spring again. The air grew warmer, carrying the fresh, clean scent of thawing earth and new beginnings. Linda and I developed a new rhythm. She still owned the house, still paid the mortgage. The payments were now current, Charlie informed me, the debt being slowly, painstakingly serviced. I was back in my old room, paying a modest, symbolic rent. We were roommates, mother and daughter, bound by a shared history and a renewed commitment to the home. We rarely talked about the past, not the greed, not the debt, not the fraudulent investment firm. Instead, we talked about the leaking faucet in the downstairs bathroom, the squirrel that kept nesting in the attic, and the color of the paint for the porch. One afternoon, I was sitting by the kitchen window, watching the rain fall in a steady, soothing curtain. I heard a small, metallic sound. Ding! Just one, solitary chime from the old silver bell by the back door. It was the same sound I had heard the night I signed the deed. The house was signaling again. I walked to the door and looked out. The lilacs. Linda was out there in the damp spring garden. She wasn't wearing my old gardening gloves this time. She was planting new lilac bushes, small, vulnerable shoots, carefully pressing the moist earth around their bases. She was investing in the future, not just liquidating the past. She looked up, catching my eye through the wet glass. "They're the Miss Kim variety, Mother," she said, her voice carrying easily through the open window. "The ones Dad always wanted." Said they smelled the strongest. I nodded, my chest swelling with a warmth that finally chased away the last chill of the coastal cottage. "They do, darling. They absolutely do." I watched her for a while, kneeling in the dirt, tending to the fragile life she was responsible for. The crimson suit was gone forever, replaced by the honest grime of hard work. The lessons of maintenance and endurance had taken root deeper than any mortgage lien. I didn't lose my home. I passed it on, not as a possession to be sold, but as a responsibility to be cherished. My last thought, the one I carry with me to this day, the one I share with all of you, is this: love is not possession. It's the courage to teach. And sometimes, the fiercest, most unforgiving lessons turn out to be the greatest acts of love. The kitchen bell rang again, a slow, gentle peal. It wasn't the wind. It was Linda standing up, calling me to tea. The final, sweet sound of a hard-won peace.